We've been working on tribalism, fragmentation in our communities, in our academic community. And our first session was right on that. What is this, right? And then how does it impact the way we do science, the way we teach, the way we deliver care, how we do research? Then we've moved to some topical areas like Dobbs, obviously touch point, flashpoint for a lot of disagreement and certainly a host of tribalism or in-group, out-group, right? We looked also at misinformation, disinformation, another area that, wow, we've dealt with it, right? And we've been either victims of it or maybe purveyors of it, who knows, right? But that was our last session. And then today, we want to talk about academic freedom, a little bit First Amendment, but from a variety of perspectives, and then get the conversation going. And that's what this is about. Whether you're online with us in Zoom or you're here, those of you who are here after we wrap things up around 6:30, we'll go out, have a little reception, and we can either continue the fragmentation or try to rebuild and heal, but we're hoping for the rebuild and heal. So thank you all for being here. I'm Mark Alicio. I'm the chair of the Department of Bioethics here. I've worked with Cynthia Caboo in Faculty Affairs to put this together at Dean Gerson's behest. And I want to turn things over then to Dean Gerson as he has a welcome for us.
Good evening. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's session on academic freedom. Of course, academic freedom used to be confined to the esoteric thoughts of our most esteemed scholars who utilize novel approaches to develop new concepts. Today, academic freedom has become politicized and equated with free speech and platforms of discourse that violate mores and sensibilities ranging from religious and political persuasion, confronting families, communities, and social systems, political systems, school systems, and pervade local and national discussions. Here in Ohio, we have been asked how many of our students are forced to sign statements linked to academic freedom about diversity. It is potentially within range, I suppose, that these responses could even be linked to funding from any and all public and private sources. A reasonable perspective on academic freedom is that it emerged centuries ago during the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, and coupled with the scientific revolution that sought to counter the dominance of religious thought. We can go to the works of Bacon, Descartes, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and even Isaac Newton. Then as now, scholars advance data, equations, and logic to develop new insights while also considering different perspectives as well as accentuating discovery as a method to uncover the links between knowledge, perception, bias, and persuasion. Today we seem quite able to merge fact and perspective and use our public voice as scholars to pursue a variety of biases and persuasions that could be seen by others as harmful. Witness the events recently at the University of Pennsylvania and Stanford. Even as our legal scholars debate the boundaries of dialogue and disagreements, we, in academia, consider discourse a wonderful thing that, when carefully nurtured, creates an environment of encouragement, engagement, trust, knowledge, and discovery that advances all of our lives. But setting boundaries around these expectations is an art form. Prior to turning the platform over to Mark Alicio, I want to take this moment to acknowledge both Mark and Cynthia Caboo's commitment to turn the concept of the Dean's Significant Conversations into several great conversations that we have had over this past year on a variety of topics. Thank you both. I also want to thank our audience members today and those who've joined us throughout our conversation series. Your feedback has been invaluable. And I would be remiss if I did not thank our staff who ensured that the lights are on, the video feed and Zoom connections are working. It takes many hands to produce this series, and I'm delighted that so many of our faculty, staff, and students have contributed to its success. With us this evening are experts in the field who have spent their careers engaging in these conversations, listening to others, refining their own perspectives, and guiding us towards a better appreciation of using our words and our knowledge to advance humanity. I look forward to a profound conversation.
Thank you, Dean Gerson. And what we're going to do is each presenter will take roughly 5 minutes to talk about, a topic we've asked them to address, some aspect of academic freedom. And then at the end, we'll open it up for discussion. So hold your questions, your comments until then, but hear their perspectives. So we're going to start with Nicole Deming, who is our Assistant Dean of Faculty Affairs, of course works with Dr. Kaboo in the Office of Faculty Affairs. And what she's going to do for us a little bit, 5 minutes-ish, so it's tough to do, but give us a sense of how you unpack rights and responsibilities that are inherent in being a member of the faculty in the context of academic freedom. So, Nicole.
Thank you, Mark. All right, so I will say thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conversation and comment on the rights and responsibilities inherent in being a member of the faculty in the context of academic freedom. The one thing I want you to remember from my comments is that in a complex and chaotic environment, which we always are, we as professionals have a responsibility to be rigorous in our academic pursuits. While we might think this is obvious, I want to address academic freedom by defining the following 3 items: the scope of the relationship within a faculty member and the institution, the rights of the faculty member, and the faculty's responsibility. According to the American Association of University Professors, academic freedom is the freedom of a teacher or researcher in higher education to investigate and discuss the issues in his or her academic field, and to teach or publish findings without interference from political figures, boards of trustees, donors, or other entities. Academic freedom also protects the right of a faculty member to speak freely when participating in institutional governance, as well as to speak freely as a citizen. While this definition references outside entities and pressures, the relationship is between the faculty and the university. Stated another way, the relationship regarding academic freedom is between you and Case Western Reserve University. Now that we have the players, we need to discuss the rules or what the faculty's rights are in this relationship. When discussing faculty rights, I think in terms of negative rights, or the rights to be left alone and not interfered with, as opposed to a positive right defining something that I am owed, that someone else, like the government or an employer, must provide for me, such as an education through high school or emergency care in a hospital. The AAUP identifies 4 elements of academic freedom: teaching, research, intramural speech, and extramural speech. I have the right to determine my syllabus. When I discuss healthcare in the Netherlands, where prostitution is legalized and regulated, I take my students to meet with sex workers and discuss their unions. I have the right to research controversial topics. If my research as a living donor reveals that live kidney donors feel used and abandoned by top institutions, including those associated with CWRU, I publish my results. Within the walls of CWRU, I have the right to comment on faculty roles in institutional governance. I can speak at faculty council sharing that I don't agree with the appointment and promotion standards. And outside of the institution, I have the freedom from institutional censorship or discipline when speaking or writing as a citizen. This last element that occurs outside of CWRU is the element where I see the greatest conflict between these rights because they are not absolute. There are limitations. These rights will conflict with other rights, and these rights can get lost if they are abused. Furthermore, it would be naive to assume that regardless of the forum, you can separate what you say from who you are as a professional. Which brings me to my final piece of the academic freedom, which is the responsibility as a faculty member. As professionals, we have a responsibility to be experts in our field. We are never done with learning, and we must be open to changing our opinions based on new evidence. When creating a syllabus or creating many syllabi, the materials must be relevant. researched, and thought-provoking. When researching, I need to use methodology that can stand up to review and identify the limitations in my study. When participating in faculty governance, I need to be informed of the current practice and the standards and best practices outside my institution. And when I speak as a citizen, I cannot ignore the reality that I am linked to my professional identity. Being a member of the Academy adds weight to my words. When I speak, I need to keep in mind that people will likely see me as speaking from a place of authority, in a cap and gown or your white coat. When we speak, we have a responsibility to back up what we say with the evidence and be rigorous in our practice.
Thank you, Professor Deming. Our second speaker will be Professor Raymond Koo, who is the John Homer Capp Professor of Law at the School of the Law. Professor Koo is going to help us illustrate the difference between freedom of speech and academic freedom. Important distinction for us.
Well, thank you for having me here. Actually, in terms of tribalism and breakdown of groups, it's kind of interesting to observe that this is my first time here in this building, even though I've been here and teaching at the law school for 20 years. So this event in and of itself is a very useful kind of way to bring people together and hopefully share different ideas and perspectives. So the easiest part of my talk is that if you claim to have a free speech right, unless it's the government that's trying to enforce or punish you for what you're saying, you do not have a free speech right. The First Amendment applies only to the government. And so under the Bill of Rights, Congress shall make no law, limits the ability of the federal government to regulate people's expression, and its adoption through the 14th Amendment, no state shall, gives you the textual basis for why the First Amendment and freedom of expression applies to the states through the federal government and the federal Constitution as well. So almost every state constitution since the beginning has had its own protection for freedom of expression and freedom of religion, but the 14th Amendment post Reconstruction allowed the kind of universal, more uniform application of free speech principles to be applied across the nation. What I've just said in the couple of minutes is highly controversial and contested in many respects. But what I want to leave you with a very important idea here is what we're concerned about when people invoke the First Amendment is government regulation of the content of speech. And it's important here to notice that this is tough in the context of education and research because the government plays a very significant role. So here at Case Western, we're a private institution. We are generally not concerned about free speech or other kind of government restrictions principles there. But as opposed to Ohio State or Cleveland Marshall down the road, the services are provided by the government, and those institutions are going to be constrained by what their governing bodies, by what the state governments and other groups would decide to do. For example, for curriculum, for hiring faculty, for hiring staff. Right? Priorities can be set by government because the Supreme Court has recognized over time that government itself has the capability to speak, right? And one of the most important ways that we communicate in our society is through education, right? How we introduce ideas and principles to our students. But even though Case can avoid some of these concerns and therefore arguably benefit the most from First Amendment protection, we also take federal funding. And government funding will often, if not inevitably, come with restrictions and limitations to that. And the Supreme Court has, since the 1980s, recognized a very, very rigorous form of government connections and requirements there, so that the government can impose a fair number of restrictions on what can be said. The Supreme Court's essentially said that we can't make you take a pledge that you believe in something like anti-prostitution, but we can limit your ability to use funds or use your position as a platform for communicating any ideas that might be inconsistent with the purpose of a particular program. Another area that we've run into, especially more recently, is this idea of a forum in universities, right? What are we as a place of discussion and debate? So when public universities are confronted with this, they very much fall into, again, this problem of they are government and they are part of the provision of government services, right? So when we invite guest speakers to the university and they're very controversial, what are the requirements for our invitations, right? What are the requirements for returning down these invitations? Those will be governed by First Amendment considerations, again, as I suggested earlier, broadly within the idea of these are the programs the institution is willing to offer, where we have much more freedom in our ability to invite guests as well as turn them away. And one thing I want to end with here, since I'm trying to cover a lot in a forum that's not for lawyers, is to really think about, when we think about academic freedom, but also free expression in general, what metaphor we're using here, right? And I emphasize this not because it's great for human thought, and that's how we think of all sorts of complicated issues. And of course, it's how the Supreme Court has looked at First Amendment concerns and tried to figure out the legal rules since its inception. But we in academia think of the forum, right? We think of open discussion and debate. Arguably, right? We want that to be very congenial and with a great deal of decorum. But other people have argued that the First Amendment actually protects, what they would think of as an open marketplace, a bazaar in which lots of voices are there, lots of loud voices are prevalent. Whereas some of the leading free speech advocates earlier in our country really thought of it more as a town hall, where people are invited to speak, people are allowed to speak, but there are fundamental rules governing how expression can be made, when expression can be done, and who can speak. So when we're thinking about these complex issues today, I want you all to think not just from the legal perspective, but from an institutional or programmatic perspective. What is that model what we're looking for, right? Because some of these models only work with rules, right? Even the free market idea of free speech, free markets only work with rules, right? Despite the idea that free might in fact be used in a much broader term. One more minute? Okay. And then, so I want to throw a controversial wrench into the works here, and it actually follows on what you introduced us with, that in academia, we do have a very serious role. Right. And society looks at us differently than, say, a traditional pundit or now an Instagram or TikTok influencer, right? Perhaps with less actual influence, but we sit in a different category. And what I see as a danger, and some of the dangers that came up as a result, for example, of the Stanford controversy, is the graying of the lines and the borders of what truly is academic and what is polemic and ideological. Right? And that is a debate that's very hard to have elsewhere. And I'm glad that we're in a forum that we can potentially address that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Koo. Now we're going to have Dr. Pam Davis, the Arlene and Curtis Gavin Research Professor here in the School of Medicine, our former dean, talk a little bit about her perspective on academic freedom as a tenured faculty leader in academic medicine. Former Dean Davis.
So thank you for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity. And thank you, Nicole, for reading the quote that I actually had to introduce, which is the AAUP's definition of academic freedom. I think it's important to frame these concepts fairly clearly, and I think we all need to be speaking the same language. I think academic freedom is fundamental to higher education and indeed to a free society. It provides for investigation of new, bold, or controversial ideas, which is essential to the advancement of knowledge. We would not have gotten past Lamarck had Darwin not studied the finches in the Galapagos. We would not have nearly eradicated smallpox had Jenner not taken the bold step of inoculating humans with cowpox. And we would not have some promising treatments for neurologic diseases had someone not challenged the belief that neurons and neural networks did not develop or change after age 5, as I was taught in medical school. Bold new ideas drive us forward. The AAUP has been a long-term champion of academic freedom. Its current iteration of its principles, though, is the 1940 Statement of Principles on Academic Freedom and Tenure, updated in 1970 with a series of footnotes. A lot's happened in the last 53 years. The AAUP has linked academic freedom with tenure since at least 1915. They say, quote, tenure is a means to certain ends, specifically 1, freedom of teaching and research and of extramural activities, and 2, a sufficient degree of economic security to make the profession attractive to men and women of ability. Freedom and economic security, hence tenure, are indispensable to the success of an institution in fulfilling its obligations to its students and to society, close quote. They firmly couple economic security with tenure. So I've been assigned to speak as a tenured faculty member, presumably about the relationship of tenure to academic freedom. Tenure is widely seen as the ultimate guarantee of academic freedom. The AAUP says that we guarantee academic freedom in part by enshrining it in our university's rules, and this is emphasized by the explicit tenure guarantees. Presumably, those without tenure are also protected by the declaration in the faculty handbook that addresses academic freedom. Tenured faculty do have greater protection against capricious removal than non-tenured faculty, though the protections of tenured faculty are not absolute. Tenured faculty can be removed for cause, such as research misconducts or sexual misconduct, and there are others as well. The AAUP also emphasizes the role of the collective, that is, the faculty as a whole, above the individual in certain decision-making. The AAUP gives the example that if the collective faculty members decide on textbook A for a course, an individual faculty member cannot refuse to recommend textbook A and instead insist on textbook B. More to the point for the School of Medicine, this means that when the faculty decides on a new curriculum, individual faculty members should not undermine or ignore it or refuse to participate in it. Also, one must pull one's weight in the collective and shoulder one's share of collective responsibilities, such as reasonable expectations of teaching and service. In addition, one's research must be at the highest standards of the discipline. Evidence-based discourse is protected, but not the promulgation of misinformation. You can't go out and teach that 2 + 2 = 5. You can't say that the sun goes around the earth, and you can't fudge your experiments to prove your points. The AAUP links tenure to economic security. Case Western Reserve has an exception to this linkage. In the mid-1990s, President Pitta announced that the university would no longer provide any financial guarantee to faculty members becoming tenured in clinical departments. Tenure at CWRU then was uncoupled from financial guarantees, at least for one class of faculty. It is unclear whether academic freedom was compromised by this uncoupling. However, the financial arguments for this maneuver were compelling. The elimination of a mandatory retirement age in academia, the lack of post-tenure review, and the assumption that at CWRU that tenure guarantees the entire salary all make continued accumulation of tenured faculty anywhere in the university a serious financial liability. These considerations should prompt us to reevaluate the relationship among tenure, financial security, and academic freedom. We might ask whether tenure or its financial guarantee is necessary to protect academic freedom. So to sum up, I believe that academic freedom is essential for medical and scientific progress, which is the lifeblood of any medical school or university. It imposes on School of Medicine faculty the requirement that we seek and share the truth in a respectful manner, mindful of the importance not only of our own academic freedom, but also that of others. The extent to which the award of tenure expands either the protections or the obligations of academic freedom is a topic for further debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Our next speaker is from the Provost Office, Dr. Don Feek, who is the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and Academic and Faculty Affairs. And he's going to give us a kind of provost perspective on academic freedom.
Great. Thanks, Mark, and thanks for inviting me to this event. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. So, as Mark indicated, I'm from the Provost Office. I'm not going to try to represent the provost or the president's very, very strong support of the concept of academic freedom and freedom of expression. I'll just try to focus on some aspects of the Central University's activities in this area. Since the Dobbs decision, shortly after that, the Central Administration convened a group to look at CWRU's statements and policies around academic freedom and around freedom of expression to see if they're strong enough, to see if they might need to be modified in light of the Dobbs decision. So there was some discussion that was generated by that and some ideas that came up that are actually still in the works. We're not quite finished with that yet. I hope that would be done fairly shortly. I wanted to highlight, though, 3 different aspects of how the Central Administration is thinking about the concepts of academic freedom and freedom of expression. One is, you may know that the university itself at the highest level has to stand for an accreditation review through an organization that's called the Higher Learning Commission. So we have to abide and prove that we satisfy the Higher Learning Commission's accreditation review, accreditation criteria. I'll read one of the criteria. It is criterion 2D, 2.D. The institution is committed to academic freedom and freedom of expression in the pursuit of truth in teaching and learning. So there's this expectation placed upon us in order for the university to maintain accreditation that we can demonstrate that we are indeed committed to academic freedom and freedom of expression. How do we do this? Well, I can tell you about 2 different ways. One is through the faculty handbook, which is the contract that provides lots of policies and places expectations on the university and on the faculty. And you've heard already 2 mentions of the AAUP statement on academic freedom, so I was going to report that here. I don't need to. We've already heard about it twice already. But let me say that the university's statement in the faculty handbook is derived from the main AAUP statement on academic freedom. There are 2 paragraphs in the handbook, and they're short, so let me just try to read them here so you know what they are. So again, this is from Chapter 3 in the handbook, if you're going to go looking for it. There's a section called Academic Freedom, sentence 1, paragraph 1. Fundamental to the purpose of the university is the belief that progress in social and individual welfare is ultimately dependent on maintenance of freedom in the academic process. Especially vital is the protection of expression, which is critical toward conventional thought or established interests. Second part, academic freedom is the right of all members of the university faculty and applies to university activities including teaching and research. Specifically, each faculty member may consider in his or her classes any topic relevant to the subject matter of the course as defined by the appropriate educational unit. Each faculty member is entitled to full freedom of scholarly investigation and publication of her or his findings. I think the important phrase there is full freedom. And what does that mean? So it's not only letting the faculty members choose what to teach in their classes and what to do research on, but I think it also means that there should not be any potential consequences to a faculty member's choice on how they teach, what they teach, and what they do in research. Okay? So there should not be any retaliation, retribution, explicit or subtle, or negative consequences to the faculty member. And that's part of what is embedded in this faculty handbook language here, and we try to make sure that that happens. So we have a person through the provost office who's the faculty conciliation counselor, and part of her responsibilities is to look into any sort of allegations that academic freedom has been sort of constrained or is being infringed upon. So we have that process within the provost office as a service to the university faculty. That's the faculty handbook part. I also wanted to mention that the university, since November of 2019, abides by a policy on freedom of expression and expressive activities. This is a formal policy that was developed through the Faculty Senate with faculty members, approved through the Senate all the way to the Board of Trustees. And let me give you the summary statement of the policy. And it is that CWRU is committed to freedom of expression. The purposes of this policy is to promote the free exchange of ideas while preserving the safe and efficient operation of the university. Okay, there's two parts to that. One is about commitment to a freedom of expression, and the other is about safety. All right, then the policy goes into a little bit more detail there. Under the first part, which is the freedom of expression part, the wording is that CWRU is committed to the freedom of speech, thought, expression, and assembly, and guarantees all members of the CWRU community the fullest possible right to hold and express opinions, to speak and write, to listen, challenge, inquire, and learn. So all of that is guaranteed in this policy, and we try to make sure we enforce that. In this section, there's an additional phrase that I think, and this additional sentence I think is very critical. And it says, as affirmed in the CWU Statement of Ethics, which the university has, and the Faculty Handbook, fulfillment of the university's mission requires an openness to new ideas and all the protection of expression which is critical toward conventional thought or established interests. So that is written into this policy, that we expect this to happen here. Again, the second part of this policy is around a commitment to safety, and I'll read a couple of passages from this part. It says that the university community members have a responsibility to support and promote this freedom for all, even in disagreement or opposition, as well as to respect the rights of all individuals. CWRU is committed to the rights of all faculty, students, and staff to carry out their academic and professional activity without coercion, harassment, or disruption. So we think these are pretty strong policies. We think that they are adhered to. And again, I think they really build into this notion that the university really does have a strong commitment to concepts of academic freedom and freedom of expression. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Feek. Our last speaker will be Dr. Jim Young, who's the professor of medicine at Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine, and actually was executive dean there for a number of years. And he's going to speak as someone who works in an institution that doesn't have tenure, but still values and cares about academic freedom.
Absolutely. I really appreciate the invitation to be here and the introduction. And I have to say that I'm speaking as a non-tenured emeritus professor of medicine in Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine of Case Western Reserve University. And I think it's a distinguished privilege to talk about that. But I have to give a disclaimer here. I was down at Baylor College of Medicine 25 years ago and went through a system which had tenure exactly like CWRU has set up. And I existed in that system going from medical student all the way up to a tenured professor of medicine. And what I saw, anecdotally, I'll admit it, not with a big research project, was a malaise that occurred with tenure, particularly tenure as back then, it was defined as a permanent irrevocable position, fully funded pretty much. But there were hazards to that, and the hazards were that malaise that had occurred. One of the reasons I came up to Cleveland Clinic, which in 1995 clearly was an academic medical center at the time, had been from day one, and was not degree granting by choice, because one of the things that could be done is partnering with great institutions like CWRU as their degree granting partner. But at the Cleveland Clinic, we do not have a tenure system in its traditional way. We're responsible for a little bit of a different world, but many at UH and at CWRU have exactly the same responsibilities that we have: patient care, research, education, and administration. And the way we work at the clinic, and why I think we have a better system, is we have what I would call yearly tenure, which can be revoked. We base it on a very robust annual performance review, or APR system, that's conducted by the department and institute chairs with a report to our Board of Governors. That's the entity responsible for all medical staff issues. It's an independent evaluation with a BOG member, Board of Governors member, also does the interviews and the discussions with the staff, which is largely, but not entirely, academic related. And the issues can be productivity, which is broadly defined, and very importantly, citizenship, which is very narrowly defined. It's defined as professionalism. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Also, the staff must embrace the mission, vision, and care priorities of the clinic and pursue behaviors that allow achievement of that. The mission being caring for life, researching for health, educating those who serve. The vision, be the best place for care anywhere and the best place to work in healthcare. The priorities, patients, caregivers, community, organization. And the values, quality, safety, empathy, teamwork, integrity, inclusion, innovation. Very specific ways that the academic staff, the non-academic staff, are all assessed, and in discussions with them, moving on with the tenure of a one-year contract. And like Toby Cosgrove used to say, he had some 40 years of one-year contracts at the Cleveland Clinic. And because the belief that tenure can lead to professional malaise and productivity lapses and even behavioral issues, and there's not unanimous acceptance of standards for awarding academic tenure, I believe that the best option is to move to an annual performance evaluation. And the 4 C's, I think, of being deserving of continuation in any program that you're in really is pretty simple. Common sense, collegiality, cooperation, competence. And I think if we abide by these principles and have in our spirit the definitions of what could be freedom of speech contained in the responsibilities that we have to be academic physicians, if you will, I think that's a much better way to go than having a tenure system. So I like our Cleveland Clinic APR system. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Young. I suspect that there's plenty of conversation to be had now with the various remarks up here. And what I want to do is get us started. First, I want to invite folks on Zoom to enter into the chat, and we'll do our best, right, to field those appropriately and get them to the right folks. But I also want to start with our students who are here. We put you right at the end of the agenda, not so much as speakers, but we want to give you the opportunity to make a comment and ask the first question of any of the panelists or all. So if you're brave and willing, I see some of our students, would you be willing to go for it? Any taker? Okay, good. We've got one. And say your name and then address, just first name.
Okay, I'm Liddy. I was wondering specifically with just how Dr. Young was discussing the yearly tenure system, and we also heard before from Dr. Davis about how you are part of Case Western's tenure system. If you have any views about the yearly tenure system, Dr. Davis specifically, or any like opinions about how that works, if you prefer yours over the other.
Pam, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think everybody is obliged to contribute to the collective to which they belong. I sort of don't like the word collective, but it's what the AAUP uses, and I think you're obliged to contribute to the institution to which you belong. I think that one of the issues in academia with the yearly system is that sometimes the best contributions take a longer time to evolve, and that it to be judged on absolutely each year and each, on a rigid timeline like that may be challenging for some of the very best people. If you think about research, there are a lot of things that take a long time, and I think that, and some of them are tremendously valuable. So I think that there has to be some kind of regular evaluation of what your contribution to the system is, whether it be research, whether it be teaching, whether it be service. But I think once a year is probably too much of a spin the wheel kind of a thing, especially for research. If you're looking at clinical work, patients don't wait, and you pretty much have to go forward. And if you have new things coming, you got to put them in. You got to learn. You got to adopt or adapt the newest ideas into your patient care. So I think from the perspective of clinical care, it may be that a yearly evaluation as to how much you've kept up, what you've done for your patients and your patient outcomes it may not be such a terrible thing. I think we come to the challenges when there's a cusp. So there's an arc in people's careers, and sometimes that arc in research comes to the point where you're not really obtaining the grant funding anymore. Though I will say that in the NIH now, a lot bigger portion of it is going to those over 65 and even over 70 and even over 75. Thank you, God. Than it used to be. But there's an arc, and I think you have to be, if you're going to stay on the faculty, you have to be willing to shift the balance of what you do to serve the whole. So it may be that your research is less, but your mentoring and your teaching and your service is more. Or if you've all of a sudden had a brilliant research idea and gotten it funded, maybe all that teaching that you did needs to go down and take a back seat to the kind of research that you're doing. So I think there needs to be regular evaluation. Once a year may be a little bit strenuous.
So I never disagree with Pam. So I completely agree.
It's not public.
I think the issues have to be put into the perspective of how individuals are trained to do the annual professional review. And having been doing them for over 20 years now, just finished up the big set for our Respiratory Institute on Friday, it's a process that, one, is learned, and two, anything that can be learned has to be taught. So we have a very robust program to educate the individuals that are doing the APR on how to look at things. And so Pam is absolutely correct in the different zones where we're evaluating people, research, teaching, patient care, or all of those wrapped together. Some things like obtaining certain NIH grants, obtaining the data that's going to result in publications and whatnot, it doesn't take 6 months. It doesn't take 12 months. It can take several years. So understanding all of those points in the discussions and in the paperwork that the APR generates is how we get around some of these limitations and issues. And I think that having a yearly conversation is good because you can pick up signs of problems developing early, particularly when you're doing serial conversations with the APR, with the individual staff. But basically, I agree with Pam.
Well, I think the other implication of that is that I'm for post-tenure reviews. You know, that you don't get tenure when you're 42,
Right.
and then, you know,
Nothing.
that's it. One of our famous chairs of medicine here who went to work for Merck afterwards and then taught at Princeton, Adil Mahmood, had a phrase for it. He said, "RO1 and go to sleep. RO1 and go to sleep." No. I think it's important to have those check-ins. Maybe not annually, but I think it's important to have them. It keeps you vital, keeps the students at the pinnacle.
All right, I'm going to be a little divisive here. One, I want to clarify, right? I mean, one of the concerns is not there is no such thing as a tenure with 1-year contract. That's a contract, right? You might have a presumption of renewal and all of those things, but tenure is very much a long-term job security at an institution as long as you continue to comply with the academic standards of that institution. Lots of people have job security through contracts of varying lengths. A year is arguably on the shorter end of that. What's important to recognize is legally the contrast is with at-will employment, right? And which is, I don't like the tie you're wearing today. You rooted for the wrong team last night. You're fired, right? And the concern there is just pure and plain arbitrariness, right? So when we're talking about academic freedom, there is this bizarre institutional development that we have essentially condensed collapsed two different jobs into the same benefit pool, right? So one, for me, it's educating attorneys and providing the community with information about law and policy in the medical school, training the future of the medical profession, et cetera. That training element isn't necessarily tied to the more traditional thoughts about academic freedom, let alone the practice of law or the practice of medicine directly, right? Where it comes in are the ideas we want to pursue, both in the classroom and in our research, right? So it's very easy to come up with metrics to say, did you show up to class, right? Have you even published anything in the last 10 years? And to ask those questions. It's another thing to kind of say, like, well, what is your scholarship? How is your scholarship advancing? Is it promoting something we value? Without essentially requiring as much trust in the institution and the formalization of the institutional process that you're describing, right? I mean, many institutions will not have that level of commitment. They will not have that identity. A new leadership comes in, a new set of priorities comes in, a new donor comes along with a different requirement. And as faculty, we can run afoul of all of those in the absence of any other kind of protection. I know at the law school, we've had issues with, for example, the cases our clinical students and faculty can take on, right? To the extent that they might be in the public interest, but run counter to a very wealthy donor. If a faculty member under those circumstances doesn't have protection to kind of make the potentially controversial choice, not just necessarily publicly, but internally within the institution, then we are subject to very much the same kind of arbitrariness as, you know, whether or not I like your tie, because the flavor of the month for ideology and politics, as we see, keeps changing.
Thank you. Let's go. Other questions? Here.
Sort of gets at a little bit what you were just saying, and it's different than the medical school. I'm thinking of the state laws and state pressure that state governments are pushing on, you know, the various courtrooms. And we think that maybe that, you know, tenure was, maybe we don't need it anymore, but then you see pressure where people losing their jobs or not being able to teach things as, you know, we can't teach critical race theory or something along, I'm just picking that up because it's a buzzword, but that sort of thing. Any comments?
Well, I mean, that's where our institutions, right, the importance of private institutions in a system that is dual, right, is so important here, right, because we provide a counter, at least in my view, to what can be a lot more politically driven curriculums. In terms of the First Amendment, the Supreme Court's drawn this very odd line of they can determine what curriculum to offer. Right. So we're not going to teach American history, i.e. critical race history. Right. But we can't take those books off the shelves. And this comes from a series of cases in the 1960s, right? So as a provider of services in curriculum and education, the government isn't required to teach you anything, right? So think about many of the debates we're seeing in local school districts, right? We don't want to teach you essentially anything about American history that's upsetting. And that is within our system of government politically allowable and consistent with the First Amendment. So the odd part is the protection that then comes in when is a professor or an instructor providing education that's inconsistent with that program. When are resources, think of the library cases that have been going on right now, the removal of books when those books already exist, right? So it's in one basic way easy to think of you're punishing one. Right? Especially the removing the books. We're punishing the speakers, we're punishing the authors, we're punishing the students that want access to that, as opposed to, well, we're only providing you a benefit or a privilege when we put that professor or that teacher in front of the classroom. What they teach, you're not being punished with. It's just essentially what society is willing to provide.
So to follow up on that very point, I just learned yesterday, reading the Houston Chronicle, which I still pick up and read every once in a while, that the state of Texas legislature in the Senate part passed a law removing tenure from the contract of any new professor being hired in any Texas state college or university. Not known whether it will pass in the House of Texas, but it rattled many individuals because of the thinking that they're paralleling Florida, for example, with some of the things that are going on in Florida. And so there is, I think, a danger to removing that. But I'm not so sure it's just a tenure argument necessarily. It's really a political argument, as you have pointed out, in my opinion. And so we'll just have to see how Texas and Florida turn out.
So I'll just join that. What I was thinking about during the question and the previous comments was that just because we have a right and a responsibility doesn't mean there aren't consequences and we don't have to fight for them, right? So, I mean, these are all challenges that we're facing, and we need to and might get hurt by them, right? We might bear the consequences of these. We might lose funding if we continue to pursue what we believe in and protect the rights of our faculty to research certain things, to teach certain things. There could be consequences. That doesn't mean that those rights don't exist or that that's our fight.
Excuse me. And the consequences don't have to be losing your job. I mean, they could build a prison next to your university, right? You know, just like they're going to do by Disney World. You know, there are all kinds of consequences. A number of years ago, the state of Ohio had a program called the Third Frontier, and they had the National Academy reviewing the applications, and Northeast Ohio kept sweeping the table of, you know, with the very large grants. I mean, these were, you know, $3, $5, $10 million grants to work in hot areas. And there was enormous political pressure from downstate to say that we're not spreading this money from the state effectively enough across the state of Ohio. And after a while, suddenly the National Academy became only one step in the review process. And that's another way that, you know, pressure can be applied. And I'm not sure that we did anything bad other than to sit here and exist in our little pocket up here. But there are all kinds of ways that don't have anything to do with tenure and jobs and anything like that. They have to do with the circumstances in which you need to live and work.
I want to comment on Marvin's original question about what's going on in Columbus. Even though that we are a private institution, we are not completely detached from what's going on in Columbus. So it's come onto the radar screen in Delbert Hall, this House Bill 35, I think it is, whatever number. And there are parts of that bill which is ostensibly written for public institutions, but there's certain carve-outs there for a couple of private institutions, including Case Western Reserve University. And it would require us to do things that might impact on academic freedom, like do something with our syllabi for our courses and reveal them to the public and make known who's teaching the courses and provide biographical information on the instructors. So the university is concerned about that and is trying to do with its lobbyists in Columbus to try to make sure that we can function as a private institution going forward.
Over here.
Bill Merrick, actually, as a follow-up, at least what.
We got multiple.
You know,
Got him on the.
Bill, then Kate.
Doesn't want to amplify my, anyway. Following up on what you were just talking about, Don, what I have is actually Ohio Senate Bill 83.
That's it.
And it's highly restrictive. And one of the things that I actually think about in terms of freedom of speech isn't just what we can say and we're protected by it, but what we ought to say, so that in fact some of the things like what's written in 83 don't become law. The equivalent is the Dobbs. Now I know for Dobbs, both at the level of the university and the School of Medicine, various statements were generated. I have no idea what the ultimate effect of those were, but at least it made a stand. And my feeling is that the equivalent has to be done here for 83.
And getting the public on our side would not be bad in some of these areas. I know that for our animal facility, for example, I was one of the people that was subject to a PETA Freedom of Information Act. They got every one of my grants and looked at the animals that we were using because someone had heard that the cystic fibrosis program was using non-human primates. Well, wasn't me, but they were looking for that. And there are experiments here that have to do with traumatic brain injury. And a lot of those are done at the VA because I will tell you, those veterans who have been subjected to traumatic injury rise up in righteous wrath if somebody interferes with a program to investigate that. So having the public on your side is a very important thing. And I don't think those guys at the VA would allow anyone to get close to the animal facility there to interfere with that. So that's another item. We can talk about things that we do in a different light.
So thank you for your comments and the discussion so far. I was hoping that you could speak more specifically to the issue of funding, federal funding and other kinds of funding in medicine. I'm a political scientist for people who don't know, and there's a perception at least that in political science, the National Science Foundation has had a very corrosive effect on the study of politics in this country, even going so far as to push us into calling ourselves departments of political science because some would argue that perhaps the study of politics is not a science. And in turning it into a science in the 1960s and 1970s, it's actually taken the politics out and it's attached prestige to people who can bring big grants into universities. Not that this isn't an issue where we work at all, that we begin to define ourselves in terms of the amount of funding and then it determines our career success later on in terms of things like joining the National Academy and the rest. So I was hoping that you could comment on the role that you see funders play, because my understanding is the clinic has different funding sources sometimes than CASE does with respect to medicine. So I'm curious how you feel about that. Thank you.
Well, I think they might have a broad range of funding sources. There are a number of things that kind of come to mind. You can't use federal money or state or local government money to study human embryos. And in Cleveland, there's a pretty restrictive law, and you have to have everything has to be separate if you're going to study tissue from from human embryos. You can't have bought the refrigerator with NIH funds. You can't have bought the pipette tips with NIH funds. It has to be completely private money, and preferably a completely private laboratory that you're not using indirect costs to pay for the space. A few years ago, well, not a few years ago, up in the CDC, the funding from the CDC to study firearms injuries was cut off. So if you want to study that, you got to do something else. Interestingly enough, this year for the National Academy of Medicine, every year they have an area of focus, and you get a few extra points if you're nominated, if you're in that area of focus. This year, the area of focus is firearm and firearm injury. So I think they do try to shape the kind of research that you can do, what you can do it with, who you can do it to, with that sort of thing. And it really helps to have a substantial amount of private money and a donor who is looking at this in a more enlightened way.
Yeah, no, I once again, I agree with Pam. Just this morning I saw that announcement about the focus on firearm injuries and whatnot, and I thought, boy, that's going to be a brave world in Washington D.C.
They're going after it.
Yeah, but I think it's a little bit of a problem, and the metrics of money and grants, indirects, non-indirect, total cash flow, et cetera, I think it is a little bit of a problem. Perhaps in the School of Medicine, we have an easier time than in the arts and sciences, the school there. But still, I think it can drive people into the wrong directions, and sometimes going after new ideas, new concepts, not quite as paying as much is worth more.
Yeah, so you usually wind up with gifts without the indirect cost recovery. So basically, the institution has to, spring for the lab and the lights and the heat and that sort of thing. So it is an issue. But when faculty sometimes wonder why, the dean and the vice dean for research and the vice dean for education are eating a hell of a lot of chicken and peas in the name of Case Western Reserve, some of that is the reason. You really need those philanthropic dollars to keep you, on the side of the angels and not get, I don't look good in orange or stripes, and I don't think Stan does either. So.
Well, but even with the R01 grants flowing in and the NIH grants, it used to, everybody jump and cheer for a $5 million grant, everybody except the people in my office, because how are we going to come up with that, 10% shortfall, the gap in the funding? And so they still haven't quite figured that out.
As another non-medicine faculty member here, the quest for funding is a very dangerous threat to those of us who teach outside of essentially medicine and maybe some technology fields as well, because where is the funding for political science coming from? Where is the funding for legal philosophy coming from? Where's the funding for English or theater arts coming from, right? We don't have government providing large buckets of money for the public's interest to engage in research, which already is a couple of different limitations there in terms of substantive reach, right? We're doing this for the public benefit. We're doing it for scientific research. We're not doing it to promote a particular school of thought, whether or not empirical research in political science has actually any validity, whether law should be looking at metaphors in First Amendment as opposed to just reading through and doing statistical analysis of keywords and cases. And so at least what I've seen in the 20-something years, 25 years of being in academia, is this increasing pressure on individuals and faculty who are in disciplines with there is no outside funding to speak of, to now go out and get it. right, which is a very dangerous course of action. Right now, at least you see it in my institution and legal education in general, the big pockets of money and deep pockets have very clear agendas. And, they will drive an institution. And to the extent that I don't have tenure to fight that, I'm in a very, very precarious situation.
Thank you. So we've got some questions in the chat. Go ahead, Amanda.
Okay, the first question is for Jim Young. Do you think that the lack of tenure inhibits or limits academic freedom?
Absolutely not.
Okay, we'll go to the second question. This is a bit of a lengthy one, so just bear with me for a minute. What do you think is fueling the malaise in tenured faculty? And this person goes on to say, I believe the pressures and stresses associated with the trajectory that one goes from student to tenured professor. If we address these pressures and stressors, then maybe individuals will not become jaded, burnt out, and maintain the enthusiasm and motivation needed to support academic freedom and vigorous research. The yearly check-ins after tenure can serve as a check-in to provide emotional and intellectual support to maintain motivation for research and academic freedom. Thoughts?
Well, our APR system, we're taught to provide those kinds of conversations and provide help for individuals that need help. Burnout is real. Burnout's a problem. It's been said that 50% of physicians today are suffering symptoms of burnout. It varies a lot. The numbers depend on how the studies are done and whatnot. But I think, But I think what you have brought up, or whomever have brought up that point, I think it is on target. And I think during the course of mentoring people that have chosen this career, don't forget, people choose the career. They can choose to do something else if they can't handle the kinds of pressures that are there in some cases. Maybe that's a little bit too cynical. But teaching individuals about what they're looking at, what they're looking into, and then mentoring them along the progress from student to, well, if we look at medicine, to clinical training, then to junior faculty, et cetera, I think there's a responsibility of the educator to work with them. That'd be my answer.
So I would also go with that relationship again for the institution. So you talked about the individual, I'll talk about the institution having a responsibility to allow opportunities for growth. So just because you did something when you were 20 and you started there doesn't mean you end there or you're in it for life. So yes, tenure is a lifetime appointment, but your activity should change and should be diverse, and you should have opportunities to envision what that looks like and to train in a new field, to contribute in different ways. I don't think we do the best job of that, saying, okay, where are you in our annual conversations, but 5 years down the road, applying to grants is exhausting. It's exhausting. And doing it every single cycle several times, I understand why people are burned out, and I don't do that. Hearing about it exhausts me. And so what are the other ways that we can do this, and how can we also get people excited again? So if it's different collaborations, it is the people and the other faculty that are the best part of this institution. And so I think, first of all, identifying what those issues are, providing different opportunities, and allowing people to change, I think is something that the institution can do a better job of providing opportunity for.
So one of the things that you see in some of these training programs is that the better or the more intensive the mentoring, the more, the easier it is to carry forward on the enthusiasm. And, one of our premier programs is the KL2 to be converted to a K-12. It's associated with the CTSA, and that was started with Rick Rudick, and Raya Dweek has it. And the mentoring there is highly, highly structured and is very, very intentional. And there's a career mentor, and there's a research mentor, and there's a requirement of meeting every 6 months. And there's not just a committee, but there are more often, contacts like that. Our graduate school, I learned from the materials that Marvin sent me, is now training people in mentoring, which I think is critical in starting people off in the right way. And, they're doing 30 people a year, and they've sent their senior people to, learn how to train the trainer. And I think that is a very important approach, because you get somebody, you get a pal, and you get somebody who is going to help you. I also think creating a cohort so that you're not all there by yourself, out there by yourself, is very important. I know this is going to sound a little disconnected, but one of the things that people have recommended to keep people fresh is to put term limits on the upper level jobs, so that you can't have somebody who's the dean for 20 years, or the president for 20 years, or the chair for 20 years. There is room for somebody else to come in and take that position. And, I've been mulling that over, but that is something that people are talking about, to make sure that the line doesn't stop when somebody good gets into that upper position.
Yeah.
And also, Pam, that for those people that have done it, for the people that have done a good job, if you put limits on that tenure, you have something else for them to go to do.
Right.
And I find that a very positive way to maintain leadership acuity, if you will. You're not moving them along necessarily because they've done a bad job. There's a different situation when they haven't lived up to standards.
I'm going to interject. What Dr. Davis and Dr. Young just mentioned. There is a sense in which we can think about obligations to the next generation, right? And it's okay to move aside, pursue a new path, and let the next generation take advantage of, play the role, take advantage of the opportunity, and so forth. And I think we all have to think about that if we live long enough and we stay in our professional settings, right? And I don't think we like to think about it. So just a thought.
Hello, everyone. So I have a question based off of actually responses to the previous questions. So we've had tenure for over 800 years now, dating back to the 1200s at Oxford University. And Professor Young, if you don't believe that lack of tenure affects academic freedom, I'd be curious to hear, what then do you believe tenure exists for?
Well, I opened up my comments at the podium by saying that I don't think it should exist. I think there are other ways to interact in an academic setting that can provide a robust experience for both the individual that is being mentored, the individual that is being employed, as well as the institution. And if we bring it back to the other end of the question was about academic freedom and whatnot. And then my 4 C's that I mentioned about common sense and collegiality, et cetera, come into play, and assessment of that. And so I think believing in that type of system will help to guarantee what you're concerned about, and that is, or what our lawyer here on the panel was concerned about firing somebody because you don't like that he wore a blue tie today. And I think we need to guard against that. And I think where the rubber hits the road on that particular one is with leadership, and having the right leaders who understand the issues in a position that has some authority.
If I may, my question is primarily concerning, it's very rare where we can identify something that's almost 1,000 years old that we've continued in this sort of in the academy for such a long time. So if you're unable to identify anything positive about tenure, I'm curious, what do you find maleficent about tenure then?
Well, I didn't go into great detail about it, but having sat in a variety of leadership positions, it's the malaise that comes on with certain aspects of tenure. And it's I think the belief that you're sitting in a permanent position just because you got there, basically. Now, I think other people on the panel disagree with me a little bit and would like to hear their thoughts. Don?
Oh, thank you.
Just to name someone.
Oh, let me think a second. Okay, so there are tenured faculty members that are underperforming. I'm not talking about the medical school, I'm talking about the university at large. And so I know that the provost has had conversations with deans about how to get those faculty members remotivated. It's not easy. It's not easy to do that. This malaise that you're talking about exists. It's a drag on the institution. We've tried doing a few things. We have an Office of Faculty Development that's putting more of an emphasis now on programs to help post-tenured faculty continue to grow and advance. It's been a little bit early for that to know if those programs are being helpful, but we're trying to work on that. That's an issue.
Could you provide any insight in, because, and I apologize for my naivety, but just running a simple cost-benefit analysis, this minority of underperforming tenured professors seems well worth the benefits of protecting the majority of overperforming, or at least expected performing, tenured faculty, no? At least in the provost's office?
Not sure how to do that cost-benefit analysis. That's something to think about, though.
Okay, thank you.
I can help with that a little bit, at least in terms of definition, right? What no one likes, aside from the person who might actually be trying to exercise that privilege, is being retired in place, right? No one wants to see a colleague who, or basically never see a colleague who has job security through tenure. Now, I don't know anyone like that in my career. Now, again, we're different generations. Maybe there's a different experience there. I know that the legal teaching market that I went through was incredibly more competitive, as like many of our job markets are increasingly more competitive each year. And the requirements for getting through those doors and into these positions are more difficult and more rigorous. And so we're doing, I think, a little better job on the front end of not just saying, okay, who is this person a student of, right? Is this a student of my friend or from this institution? But what's this person doing? How are they performing? I know when I look at a tenured faculty member for a hire or a new entry-level person is this person a thinker, right? Someone who's going to be engaged for their lifetime. And I think a lot that helps at least remove the retired in place. The burnout and the malaise is all on the institution, right? Many of us, I'm a person of color. I am the only person of color up on this stage, one of, at one point, only 2 or 3 in the room. And I will tell you that the support for faculty, once you're even through the tenure door, is horrible. Right? Especially once you're tenured, at least in legal education. What do we have to worry about? You're tenured, right? And then the only other thing then we're looking for is more money, more promotions, maybe a title. And so keeping that person engaged, recognizing them as a valuable contributing member of the community is so important. And mentorship helps, right? But mentorship is random. Right? Not necessarily in the sense that people get assigned mentors, but the ability for the people to connect is incredibly random. And to the extent that it's based on demographics, right? Does this young faculty member look like me, remind me of me? And if that person does, I'm probably going to help them out really well if I have that energy. If they don't, well, I'll have lunch with them, when I'm required to, and we'll talk, and maybe that'll connect. And recognizing that individual as a tenured human being that still needs to be engaged and wants to be engaged, even if their engagement is nutty, right? Even if they can be a pain, is important. And that's very difficult in an institution, especially I think in the last 50 years, higher education's gone through a very dramatic transformation from being much more culturally small communities to much larger institutions with very corporate-driven managerial thought processes. It's lost to some extent and maybe can never regain that interpersonal connection that helped that growth. Just a weird anecdote here. I asked a professor of mine after I started teaching, I said, there's all this animosity in legal education and legal academia. What do you see is the cause of this? And his response was, we let people like you in. Right? So it's not just the group of people that went to the same prep schools and the same universities and then practiced in the same groups who knew one another and knew one another's parents and faculty. And so that, when we expand into this much more broad, diverse world of ours, requires an attention that I don't think we've been able to provide right now.
Right. So I'll say, yes, it's uncomfortable, but I'm glad we're uncomfortable, right? So I think it's a problem that we need to deal with. I think we're talking about it and we're headed in the right direction. I'm glad that it's not just the good old boys club, that everyone went to the same institution or because they did that. But the other thing that I was thinking about is now I'm flipping it, right? So it's not just the institution, but now I'm going on the side of the faculty's responsibility is I also have a responsibility to seek mentors, right? So I could be assigned someone or my chair. He's lovely, right? He can't be everything for me, right? I need to identify what my goals are, what my needs are, and then ask for help. And it may be harder to find someone who looks like me or has a similar pattern. That doesn't mean I can just be passive. And it may take a lot more work because of who I am or what I look like or what my pedigree is. But I also have a responsibility. So it could be a failure of the individual, a failure of the institution. But I think we can teach each faculty member to do more. And I think as an institution, we can do more to embrace that and put forward better programs.
So as a chair, I'm going to interject again. No. When it comes to Nicole, no. I do think at a leadership level, whether it's dean, chair, provost, we need to think about also what we want in our faculty, right? And what I basically want is our faculty be pretty much happy in their professional lives. We can't control all the stuff, and some people won't be happy no matter what. There's the Buddhist, wherever you go, there you are. This is a problem, right? But you can find fit, right, between the skills, the aptitudes, the interests of particular faculty and the needs of your department. And I think you shouldn't be afraid to try to move around to make that work. Because in the end, we tend to thrive as humans a lot more and do pretty amazing things when we kind of like each other and get on. It's not the old, bastardized Darwinian of survival of the fittest is I beat the crap out of you and so I'm the fittest. It's fit in the environment, which allows for flourishing. And we can do it, and we can do it better than we've been doing.
I just want to change gears a little bit here. I'm sorry. You were speaking earlier about, it's academic freedom versus like freedom of speech in the general sense that a lot of people talk about it, which is like the freedom to just say whatever, as opposed to like the way the founders were thinking of it, as in like the freedom of the open forum for us to exchange ideas and to challenge each other. How do you see the institution's role in when you have these groups that want to I want to invite this speaker who's a neo-Nazi to just promulgate these crazy ideas without any real scholarship? What do you see like the institution's role in challenging that, or just like allowing it and like everybody yells, or like how do you see that working out?
Me? Okay. As a professor, so I'm going to obviously kind of come from that perspective. It's important that when we invite speakers or assign readings, that we fundamentally believe there's educational value to that, that my students, the members of the community, the members of the public will learn something from that experience. I mentioned earlier that there's been a blurring, in my view, of the lines of what is an academic and what is educational. And I think the danger is that we must become open forums because somehow freedom of expression means my freedom to say whatever I want, has become this kind of, the slogan model TikTok meme that wants to be used to kind of pummel us with this idea that every idea, every speaker, every expression is equally valid. Right now, every human being may be equally valid as a human being, but the ideas they espouse are not necessarily going to be equally valid. And they certainly, in the context of an academic institution, may not serve any of the purposes that the academic institution is hoping to achieve. And so when we're looking at whether we should invite a speaker, right, is that speaker going to educate the community, the class? Is there another way to provide that education without necessarily doing it in that particular way? And I've been in administration also as a faculty member. I want to leave that generally in the faculty members' hands, right? But there is the danger too of there are some faculty members that are more than happy to, in part because of the money they're getting, bring in anybody that will, consistently provide a message, was in a forum in an event where the person didn't even want to engage in the real issues, but wanted to talk about misinformation by spreading misinformation. And the only way we can fight that is really by confronting that directly in the context of the event. And I think, unfortunately, in some places like Stanford, there are people who feel like they're so frustrated that they can no longer do that in a meaningful way that allows another person to speak. Right, that they feel they need to close the opportunities that the person should never have been presented. And that's dangerous for everyone involved, but also quite understandable.
Let's go with one last question here, and then you comment as you see fit, and then we'll wrap things up. Go ahead.
Since there is an inherent tension between the ability to research and gain new knowledge with what is known now. And that's kind of has always been my understanding of what tenure provides, is that a freedom to explore and create new learnings. Where does that rest in medical education at a time when perhaps we're limiting our ability to teach how we take care of patients, or we are able to gain new knowledge for research?
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. There is, in fact, a tension between the status quo and new ideas. And I think in medical education, Case Western Reserve has always prided itself on being in the avant-garde of doing medical education. And for the most part, we've done that. We did allow ourselves to get a little stultified, but we've done other things, and I think that we welcome different approaches. The home of hollow anatomy, the home of Western Reserve too. One of the early pioneers in interprofessional education, other kinds of things like that. I think we've done that, and again, I think it comes down to leadership and the willingness to look at new ideas and to allow them to come in. On the research side, I think that boils down to leadership too. I could tell you a little apocryphal tale, which is, actually true, about a leader in our medical school who did not agree with the work of one of the faculty members in the group, and came to the dean and asked that the person be investigated for misconduct. And it turned out that the misconduct was that the supervisor did not believe that the right antibody had been used in a Western blot, which was in a paper that got published in Cell. Okay, well, misconduct is falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism, and the wrong antibody is not misconduct. But there was a great pressure on that faculty member who ultimately left us because of the pressure from above. And I think there are always people who believe that, you know, God himself has bent down and whispered in their ear the truth and justice of research. And, you know, those people are very, very hard to dissuade. So I do think that there are issues here. But we've also had extraordinary breakthroughs and understandings and new ideas come out of our labs. And I think we can be very proud of a lot of the things that have come out of Case Western Reserve. And I think for the most part, we've encouraged that. We've taken a deep breath sometimes and, you know, prayed that it turns out to be, science is a self-correcting process, right? We hope this isn't one that gets self-corrected. But, you know, we let them go forward.
Yeah, no, I was just going to quickly say, Pam, you left off CCLCM. I mean, just a great example of moving different concepts forward. So my world of heart failure, transplantation, mechanical circulatory support devices, way back, it was cardiomyoplasty, ACORN, myosplint, Batista procedures, I've just seen this panoply of surgical procedures go by, and constant. And today we have robust mechanical circulatory support devices. And so I think tomorrow we're going to have permanent ones that are great. I think that's science. That's what we do. And that's how we're going to push things forward. I think it's a bright future.
So thank you. Jim, you're going to get the last word for this one. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to those of you online. And of course, let's continue the conversation. For those who are here out at the reception with some refreshments, for those of you who are online, you know, carry it forward because that's what these are about. All right. Thank you.